I omitted one piece of information earlier. Our music director wants you to know that she has a sprained left finger today. I told her I shouldn't tell you, that you wouldn't notice. I haven't noticed, have you? No. So you are now supposed to go and see her afterward and said, if you hadn't told me, I never would have noticed. And to remind her that we love her even if only 9 of her fingers are working at a given time. Rare are the days when we know joy and sorrow so clearly as we do today. I shall speak of that in time, but let us grasp that this day too was made for us here and now. Led by a more ancient clock that sees in summer's end a turning page, we sense a newness in the air. Despite the calculated gloom of news and politics, with its muffled drum of misery, the heart cannot resist autumnal hopes. We should be glad, we should rejoice, for today we live, and in living we say grace for it by seizing hope for another day. Though what we honor now is filled with pain, we put it on because the yoke of hope can bear it. May these words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be found true in thy sight, thou who art my rock and my Redeemer. It's hard to start a church season on a day like this, isn't it? Too earnest and the spirit falls leaden on the ground. Too light and the momentousness is brushed aside. We want to be optimistic and happy, and perhaps we have good reason to be. Who wants to be sad and somber after all? There's no pleasure there. There's a familiar psalm text. It's out of the 30th, I believe. Weeping may tarry for the night, but joy comes in the morning. And we are America, the land of joy and happy endings, of promises and opportunities, of doorways of hope. So that's why I think one of the reasons we are so troubled by that assault, that crime, that cataclysm of 10 years ago. It violates our sense of goodness, our own goodness. Why would anyone do this to us, of all people? Either they are wrong and thus evil, or we are wrong and that makes us evil. And neither of these are very pleasing thoughts. But of course, we chose the first, who wouldn't? And it's easier to handle thinking the other fellow is wicked than to think yourself wicked. But at a cost, I dare say, a cost I have come to talk about today, a cost we have only begun to pay. 2,966 people officially died on that day, at least of that, as Ruth reminded us, scores more died unremarked and unnoted, including the wife of Calvin Trillin, the wonderful commentator. But these are the ones we mark today. Since then, 51,000 have died in Afghanistan. 100,000 have died in Iraq. And again, not counting those who died just because they died. Wars begun, at least in part, because of what happened 10 years ago. The economic cost of 2001, someone enumerated as upwards of $242 billion, not just the loss of the buildings and everything else, but the loss of our own economic vitality, all the things that were the direct result of that. That was 10 years ago. A year and a half ago, someone calculated the cost of all the things we have done in response, notably the 2 wars. We've spent $1 trillion on them, so it seems to me we have spent at least $4 for every one that we actually lost. We wonder what's happened to the economy. Why do we not hear about this as much as any debt? I have no expertise in the algebra of government, of course, nor of war, though I suspect even the experts are less wise than they themselves claim. But these are not the costs I want to name today. Rather, there are losses more profound and ultimately more powerful than all the numbers we can muster. Though it may sound arrogant to say so, this is where I do have expertise, in the sorrows of the human heart. For I have officiated hundreds of funerals, watched not only those I know, but those I loved, those close and far, go into the ground, and watched those who left behind, wept and sighed and lost. I number among them not only members of this church, but of 4 other churches I have served, not only those that I knew well, but those who were strangers and came to my doorstep only at times of grief. I number my mother, my father, my father-in-law, my mother-in-law. I number 2 of my own children. Of the sorrows of the human heart, of this I am acquainted, and for this I will speak, but not quite yet. Unlike Ruth, I was in Brooklyn at the time, right across the river, bird's eye view. Actually, it's a beautiful view. If you go to New York, you should go to my old neighborhood and look at the promenade and see the city. It is splendid there. But I discovered not only is Ruth an eyewitness in this church, but there are at least 2 or 3 others. You didn't know that, did you? I didn't until a month ago. Now, when I first saw it, I didn't see it all. But I was downtown. It was just a fire. No one quite knew why the World Trade Center was on fire. Everyone was mystified. How did that happen? It was horrible to contemplate, but it was just a fire. And people were worried. The news was as confused as we were. Of course, that's what we do, don't we? We turn on the news to find out what's going on, and they never seem to know, do they? But they seem to not know it over and over again. Until we all do not know it with the same confidence they do not know it. But in my case, we looked at the news, and I could look right out the window next to the television and see exactly the same picture, the tower, the clouds of smoke, and listening to the unknowing news anchors speak knowingly of their unknowledge. And then, unexpected to everyone, the second tower erupted in flame, because we weren't looking for another one, were we? No, not even those of us who were there. And then suddenly it was no longer a fire, it was a war. It was that fast. I didn't actually see the explosion because of the way my windows were set up. What I did was I heard it. You know, in New York, they're always building something. That's the old story about the young man who moves to New York and wants to show his father, the farmer, what it's like in the big city. So he gets his father to visit and shows him around here and there and everywhere to impress him, and finally says, "Dad, well, what do you think of New York?" And Dad says, "It'll be a nice town when they're finished building it." But things are always being built. So there's noise all the time, and cranes. And so I thought it was a construction accident. They were actually building a new federal courthouse not far from us, one that was going to be safe from terrorism, by the way. And so I said, oh, that sounds like a terrible thing that happened over at the courthouse. And then I heard feet running on the street, and I heard people yelling and screaming, and I knew that something else was up. And at that point, I realized that something more than we expected was happening. I showered quickly. I had to get to work. I didn't know what I was going to do, but ministers have to do something after all. In the middle of toweling off my wife at home at this point, she moaned. And that was the first tower as it came down. At that point, I didn't even bother drying off. I just threw on my clothes and ran out the door, up to my office 3 blocks away. We didn't know what to do. People said, let's give blood, let's find food, let's make phone calls, all of which were perfectly useless. The first thing you need to know, friends, is that when something like this happens, there's nothing you can do. You just watch. We were conscripted witnesses, involuntary audiences, which was exactly the point. Not for a day or so would we know exactly what we were seeing, but all of us were literally imprisoned by where we were and what we had to do.